fingers are cold.
Yeah. No, I literally like Parker sits next to me and I'm just like. And he's like, stop it. And I'm like, warm my hands.
Warm them. See,
That's what my dad used to do. He just like hold my hand.
That is sometime in March. We have Wael Morcos of Morcos Key from New York City. He is going to talk about type design, and he's doing a workshop around Arabic lettering. And then our last talk of the year is with Tamiko Teal. She's an artist who works primarily with augmented reality around climate change. She is coming to us from Berlin. She's an MIT grad. She will also be doing a talk and a workshop. Her work has been both in the Whitney and the MoMA, so we're very excited to have her as well. So we have quite a breadth of speakers across activism, design, emerging technology, ethics, and so on. So you can follow our Eventbrite, our Facebook, our Instagram. We're trying to stay on top of those. This is also one of the first times that we'll be live streaming, so those are starting to be archived on our YouTube, so you can find that as well, DePaul's School of Design Talks. And I think that's about it. For those of you that were excited about the raffle, there are 2 items. We will be raffling those at the end. The general format of the talks is that we will have the speaker, we will do QA, and then we will do the raffle, just so you know the format for tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Denise Naku. She's our new School of Design Director, and she will give you the gist of everything else. Thank you.
All right, let's clap for Heather. All right, good evening. I know many of you. I'm really happy to see many students, undergrads, grads, colleagues, mentors, staff in the room. I'm very honored to be here to bring this community together. Our talks are really meant to cultivate this spirit of community, learning, inspiration, and being able to use design to make this world better and more equitable. I also want to thank Heather Quinn and the CDM staff who have done an outstanding job of getting this event organized. I'm really excited for the lineup we have for the year, so I hope that this is not the only time you will be here in the room, and you can spread the word, and next time bring a friend, and we're going to grow this community. So hope to see you in the next events that we have coming up. Tonight's speaker she's the founder, president, and CEO of the Creative Reaction Lab. And I know that she is in high demand around the country and around the world to share her ideas as a leading designer. And so we are really lucky to have her here to share her perspectives with us at DePaul. And please join me in welcoming Antionette Carroll.
Hello? Is it that one?
I think let's use this one. Is that mic'd up right there?
This is for the video.
Oh, okay. All right, there we go. And the clicker's right there.
All right. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Antionette.
Let's try that again. I thought we figured it out earlier today for my workshop people. Let's try that again. Hello, everyone. Hello. I'm like, come on, Chicago, let's go. Okay. So I am excited to be here. Earlier today, I was able to work with some of the students and faculty around very short workshop, but I'm now here to talk about more about my journey, which I really didn't speak as much about earlier today, some of the work that we've done at my organization, and really thinking about where we are trying to move and go in the design industry, as well as just in society as an entirety, and thinking about the impact of oppression, inequality, and inequity, and the fact that we can be redesigners for justice. And so there's intentionality in my title and talking about the future of leadership, because many times when I come into spaces, especially design spaces, we tend to talk about the future of design leadership. But the reality is that leadership is across the board, and the reality is that design plays a role in that space, identity plays a role in that space, power, etc. And so I'm definitely going to center a lot of that in the conversation that we have today. So, oh, wow, I'm big. But that outfit looked good, though. But so a little bit about myself. My name is Antionette. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the founder, president, CEO of Creative Reaction Lab. I didn't mention earlier, but I am also the co-founder and co-director of Design Plus Diversity LLC. Yes, I do run 2 businesses. No, I do not sleep. And yes, I am talking about starting a 3rd one, actually. So, for me, I am one of those people, and I've always been one of those people, if I see a problem, I feel that I can do something about it. Someone in a session I was just at this week in DC, they asked us to think about our 18-year-old self and what was our greatest accomplishments. And everyone was a little upset at me because I went first, because they were saying, oh, I had just got a job or things of that nature. I was like, well, I was president of National Honor Society and I founded Science National Honor Society. And the thing was, because I've always been that person where if I see a deficiency, I'm not going to just talk about it, I want to do something about it. But that also means that I am not the best person to give advice when it comes to sleep, when it comes to the idea of self-care in the traditional sense. I have my own definition of that, but I believe that I was put on this planet for a reason, and my life is not infinite. So I want to create the impact I can while I am ultimately here. I am in all of these capacities, whether it's volunteerism, whether it's something I do for, pay. It's all around the reality of me being a social entrepreneur, around the reality of me being a designer and an equity and diversity and inclusion specialist. All of this is intersected for me. There's not a separation. I cannot be one without the other, and I will always bring each one into every space in which I show up. Also, I am a fellow of many different programs. The one that people notice the most is the TED Fellowship, because that is probably more known than every other fellowship. Most people have heard about TED Talks. Yes, I am one of the TED Fellows. I also am a fellow of the Echoing Green program, which was a program that supported the Startup Teach for America, Public Allies, City Year. We are supported by Echoing Green as an institution because they believe what we're doing is going to create systemic change and big, bold impact. And then the last one that I have on here, even though I was just named another fellow for something earlier this week, but it ain't been announced yet, so I can't tell y'all. But I was recently named in September the Anti-Defamation League and Aspen Institute's Civil Society Fellow in the inaugural national program. That, of course, means that I literally have trips planned already on my calendar to 2022. So again, I don't get to sleep, but very excited about these opportunities. And one of the things I mentioned to the workshop participants earlier today is that when I go through these fellowship programs, it is not because I want to be put on a pedestal. It's partly to amplify the work we're doing, yes, but also acknowledging the fact that I grew up in an environment that didn't have access to many of these spaces. And so I've had to essentially go through other mechanisms and means to get in a room, and also acknowledge the power that I have to be in those spaces and see how I can have the youth that we work with show up in these environments so they don't have the same barriers in which I had. Also, show of hands, how many people know AIGA in this space? Kid you not, I was literally just on an AIGA call up until 10 minutes ago, but I am a national board member for AIGA. I was the founding chair of the Diversity Inclusion Task Force, amongst many other initiatives, which I will talk about in a minute. So a little bit about my story. I grew up in an environment where now that I look back, they tell me I was in poverty, but I didn't realize that I was. I had a loving family, but it was a very non-traditional family. I was raised by my grandparents, but my mother and my father was always still in my life. And my uncle and my aunt also were other parents. And so in other words, I really couldn't get away with a lot of things because I had 3 parents at one time. But when I think about the work that I do and the systems that I'm trying to shift, they tend to be at the center of it. I tend to think about the different health issues that they've had in their lives, the people that we lost too soon in my family. I also think about the lack of opportunities or kind of the stereotype of what we thought we could be because of what society told us we were deserving of. So even though I've worked since I was 11 years old, and technically it's not legal, but back in the day they were a little bit looser. So I worked since I was 11 years old. Most of the time it was in restaurants. Like my first job was at Burger King. And I worked at White Castles. I empathize with them, and I understand them trying to get you out of the drive-through, because you're messing up their time. So I understand where they're coming from. But I also grew up in a family where if you weren't in restaurants, you essentially was a housekeeper. And I remember in my family, everyone talking about the reality that if you can make at least $10 an hour, then you've made it in life. Like, that was ultimately the goal. It wasn't $10 an hour until you went to college or things like that. It was, if you get $10 an hour, you are officially okay. And when I started to calculate that, I was like, oh, wow. We actually were so content in being in $19,000, $20,000, which most people out when they leave college, they would be like, I would never. But we were okay with that reality. And because we didn't define who we were by our funding, but we also didn't recognize the limited access that we had due to the lack of funding. We didn't think about the reality that almost everyone in our family has high blood pressure, has diabetes. I've had family members that had amputated body parts. It was the norm, and that to me is part of the problem, of the lack of consciousness, of the lack of understanding of the systemic barriers that which we face. And it's not a detriment to my family, because they're amazing people, but I want them and others to understand how systems have affected us, and we're not victims, we actually can do something about it. And so that has inspired my work, and that is what actually led me into my first fellowship program in 2015, which was in a program called Starting Block. And Starting Block is an international social innovation fellowship. FYI, most fellowships pay you, or they give you free things. Starting Block is the one you pay. I just want to put that out there. Sign up for the scholarships if you want to go to Starting Block. But it was interesting because I'm in a room with people that works at Facebook, that's at Goldman Sachs, all these different institutions I never would have thought I had access to. And they are now going through the same thing as myself, looking at how do we actually create a social impact within our society. But we never truly had definitions or discussions around the power differentials that we were dealing with, the differences in our upbringings, and how that has impacted our perspective. And so at the high level, it was social impact. But I found over time that if we don't talk about identity and power and all these things that show up, it's a Band-Aid, and it's very blanket. And so I've been trying to do work around that. So here's my timeline. And I wanted to show this for two reasons. One, I ain't that old. And I have to say that because most people assume that I am a lot older than I actually am. I am 32 years old. That's it. I'm very proud of it. And I also, again, didn't go a traditional route. I am a mom of 11-year-old boys. That means when I was 21, I was having my kids. It was a personal choice because I also have a chronic illness called Crohn's disease. And they said that I may not have kids later in my life. And so most people look at where I am now and assume that when I'm older, that I've had different situations to access. I know what food stamps is like. I know WIC. I know all these things. And that didn't stop me from getting where I am today. And but I also didn't forget that I went through all that to get where I am today. I think going through those experiences actually opened up my eyes more than if I just look on the outside in and say, oh, I need to help people with that situation, right? But then I also wanted to show just kind of the trajectory of my career a little bit. So I technically graduated in my undergrad in 2009. It's very hard to believe that I'm officially 10 years out of undergraduate studies. I went the advertising and marketing route with my design career. I studied graphic design, but I ultimately graduated with a communications degree because I could not stay awake in that art history teacher's class. Y'all laughing. This was a serious thing. I mean, I had intentions on having a minor in art history. I loved it, and this woman was so hard to stay awake in her class because, and I started as a biology major. My intention was to actually to study the human genome and get a PhD in biotechnology. I had a 4.0 in biology. I was able to stay awake in biology class, but I could not stay awake. She was a magical person, okay? So took the design courses, technically didn't get the degree because you apparently have to have that art history class to have that BFA. That being said, I did do design work, traditional advertising work. I worked in nonprofit, I worked in agency, and I worked in corporate. But ultimately, I recognized that working in the nonprofit space was more of my alignment. I did not enjoy doing work for AT&T. I didn't see a connection to my social mission. And so I went on this trajectory and journey on trying to figure out what is social impact design, or social design or design for good or whoever you want to talk to, there's different titles. And how do you actually have a career in this space? Because we were not taught those things in school. You were essentially taught to go the more traditional route. But then also, again, if I saw disparities, I wanted to create change in it. So even when I was in undergrad, I pushed for them to create not the first advertising club, but the first AAF affiliated advertising club in college, which is American Advertising Federation. We also was the first student group to actually participate in the National Student Advertising Competition at a regional and national level. And so that led me to receiving Most Promising Minority Student in 2009, which was a big deal because no one at my university has ever accomplished that. And then fast forward to this year, and actually that's not correct because it says nominee. In this year, actually last month, I won the Innovator Award for AdColor for the work that I've been doing for the past year, as well as was named as a GD USA Personal Watch. And I look at all this and I'm like, this is great and all, one, still so much to do, but also acknowledging the fact that I went from not having anyone in my family go to college or graduate high school to going to college to ultimately trying to create change over time and doing it for passion, not for recognition, and finding my journey and my path. It wasn't laid out in front of me, I essentially created it. And I think that's one of the things that we need to remind ourselves of, is that if it's not there, that means it's just waiting on you to create it. And that's what we need to work towards. So in the work that I've been doing, most people like to put the solo person on the pedestal and make it seem like they're the only one that's been doing the work. I've had the joy of working with many, many people throughout the years. And this special group right here was the founding, or one of the founding task force groups for AIGA. And these are people all over the country that essentially have been working to try to diversify the design industry. And that is through graphic design, UX design, a little product design, but the traditional, in this case, design space with AIGA. But then myself, while it was great doing work with them, I recognized that there was bureaucracy that you have to deal with in pre-established institutions. So I still do work with AIGA, obviously, I haven't escaped, but I also recognize that there was more that could have been done outside of the system. And so while I was an entrepreneur, and still somewhat is, I'm very much more of an entrepreneur now in going through that journey. And so what you see here, these two sets of photos are from a conference called Design Plus Diversity Conference. We actually held it in Chicago this year for our 4th one. Next year it'll be our 5th conference. And we've been bringing together people from around the country to think about how do you design diversity, what is the social justice impact of design, as well as how do we build our own consciousness of traditional diversity, inclusion, and equity in the design industry. And so it's been a great time, and the individual at the top is my co-founder, co-director, and he's my best friend when he's not getting on my nerve. And then this group of individuals right here, 2 years ago, not this Tim, another Tim, he works at Zillow, used to be at Microsoft. we co-founded the Design Plus Diversity National Fellowship Program. And so it's for college students, junior year, senior year, graduate, or up to 3 years out of college, the individuals that essentially want to deepen their social impact craft and also have a network of support in doing it. And so this fellowship, we've partnered with Google, Microsoft, and Adobe to bring this to life. And I encourage you all to apply if you're interested. But with this fellowship, they receive a free trip to the conference. We pay for hotel, we pay for airfare, we pay for the ticket itself, and they get a very, very nice swag bag. And I am very big on the beauty of swag. It's important, okay? All right. So as you can see from the first fellows, in their swag bag, they receive free laptops from Microsoft, because there should be great swag. But that's not the actual reason why we received these laptops. It was because when we started to analyze what were some of the barriers that we had as practicing designers, we acknowledged that design is a very expensive industry. I still remember my first design course when my teacher told me, I can't tell you the definition of design, but I will tell you that the Mac is the Bible. And when you're young, you're like, oh my goodness, I need to go spend thousands of dollars on a Mac. But if you don't have the money to do that, you end up honestly spending more money and more time because you have to use the public computers, or you have to go to the library, or all these different things. And so we were trying to think about what are different avenues and opportunities for these fellows to help them not only in school but also in their own craft, beyond just giving them access in the room, but also technical things that they need as well. And the reason that we were doing this is the reality is that our industry doesn't look that great. And in the 1990s, there was an article that says, why is graphic design, or why is design 93% white, is what it was in 1991. And then we realized that we didn't have any updated stats, and so we needed to actually conduct our own study. And so AIGA, myself, partnered with Google to create the Design Census project. And this project has been around for 4 years now, in which we were directly looking at the reality of who actually makes up our industry. All of this data is open source, so you can download it if you want. But as you can see here, we're not looking that great. And of course, you can break it down across other identities as well. But as a Black designer, according to Design Census, I am 3% of the design industry right now. That is problematic when you think about all the areas in which designers touch. When you look at indigenous representation, 0.2%. Latinx representation, 8%. Asian, 9%. And honestly, I wish they would break that down even more than just Asian. We hear. But it's like when we see this, we could sit there and say, well, it's always been that way. But the reality is that it doesn't have to be that way. And yes, this is something that is impacting many industries. It's not just design, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing something about it. And so that's what I've been trying to do my partly the entire career, is try to do something about that. And so in addition to having the numbers or doing my own tactical programmatic pieces, I recognized that we actually needed a collective strategy and roadmap on how we're going to shift our own industry. And it wasn't going to happen with someone by myself doing the work. And so in 2018, Creative Reaction Lab, AIGA, partnered with Microsoft to host the first Design for Inclusivity Summit to start building out a roadmap and strategy on what our industry actually needs to actually shift ourselves to be more inclusive and representative. And so I'm gonna show a video of what essentially was discussed during that day, if I can get it to work. How do I do it? They said it was up. Where do I click? Oh, here it is. Oh, Firefox? Oh. Sorry about that. So at the Design for Inclusivity Summit, we saw the importance of having community and industry at the table.
When we say community, there are so many passionate, motivated, creative people creating change. And part of me just say, wow, how can we help make this even better for them?
When we have a summit like this, let's think about who that we is. If all of us are here as leaders in our current form, who are we opening doors for?
We have to collectively come together to solve this problem. No single company can do it. No single person is capable of fixing this.
The key to inclusive design is including people in the process, in the conversation, in the shared awareness of what it is.
As a disabled person working in accessibility, I had a unique power that a lot of times people would listen to me and they appreciated the insight I could give, so they didn't make some basic accessibility mistakes before the research even started.
I've always been the other in the room. So I think when you talk about inclusion, you start to create spaces where others feel comfortable.
I think a lot of companies, a lot of industries are looking at diversity and inclusion as an initiative. That's something you need to work on, versus how do we be more intentional in terms of the outcome.
If I were to define what design is, it would be deliberate intent. The key to inclusive design is not only as a designer understanding your role as a communicator, but also understanding who you're speaking to on behalf of.
I think where real learning happens is when you hear about other people's experiences and you can be in a conversation with them, because then you can make connections that you'll remember for a long time.
I think one of the biggest barriers is actually just empathy. If you don't feel safe in the room to share your ideas or to share your identity, you will never get to the bigger solutions.
When I look at community and designers that do work in human-based as well as geographic community, I view individuals that are living experts in their spaces, and they are really able to think about the day-to-day impact of whatever is impeding them and impacting them.
This idea of belonging, and I want to help create that for our culture, for our place of work, but also for the whole industry. So you belong, we all belong.
Where is this? If it's not in Chrome, what other thing exists? Let me see. Oh, PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see. How do you enlarge PowerPoint? I don't use PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. All right. Sorry. And so, why is it doing that? And so what was interesting about this is that we brought together almost 100 people to develop these different kind of frameworks around community, around pipeline, etc. And it was a great moment, and also it was an utter failure. And I'm gonna be transparent about it because I always am. But it looked great on paper. We have a shiny video. You got Microsoft, you got Cooper Hewitt, you got HP. I mean, this is what you put out in the sponsored social media post, right? But there was no follow-up and there was no follow-through. And it just became one of those other things that didn't happen. And the intentions were great, but the impact was extremely problematic. Are there still efforts now to try to build upon what happened? Absolutely. But as soon as we did this, the executive director at AIGA left. Everything that had happened was essentially disappeared. Even AIGA as an institution, and I love them because I'm highly involved, but we went from an institution that was led by a white woman, a black man, and an Asian woman to a white man, a white man, a white man. So all the work that we had did over the last few years dissolved immediately. Is it shifting again? Yes. But I have to admit that it is tiring when you continually are hitting a wall and you kind of go up and then you drop back down. But I mention that because, one, I feel like too many times we give this illusion that everything works out and that everything is perfect. Everyone gets up in front of you and shows you the shiny poster and say, look how great it is. And sometimes it's not even a poster that was used. I want to be one of those individuals that talk about the reality that this work is hard. And it is something that's going to be ongoing. And this is something that is, whether we're trying to increase diversity and inclusion in the design industry, or we're trying to actually address issues like gender inequities or racism or mass incarceration, this work is not going to be a straight up. It's going to be up, down, and all in between. And I made essentially commitment to myself and my community to do something about it and just be okay with that journey and knowing that that's just going to be a part of the process itself. So when I think about some of the things in our industry or problems, we tend to come up with many different justifications on why there are issues within our space. One of them is we hear a lot of the lack of the talent pipeline. Well, they're not in the field, or, there's not, they're not in the schools. And I'm not saying that there's not areas of opportunity of growth and improvement in that space, absolutely. But I also think that we need to shift our mindsets and culture in this space to understand that even the restrictions that we are calling out may be also prohibiting others from doing efforts and work in this area. And so apparently I said this a while ago. I didn't remember saying this, but a friend of mine tagged me on LinkedIn and said I said it. So by all means, but I guess I said, we don't have a talent pipeline issue, we have a perception issue. Let's seek talent somewhere else than the typical pedigree. And I have a son that wants to be a designer. And I don't think he would have wanted to be a designer if he actually didn't have two parents that actually went to school for design, because his dad also went to school for design. I grew up in a family where art and design, well, design didn't exist, but art was a hobby. It was still supported, but it wasn't a commercial venture. My father was extremely upset when I changed my major from biology to design, which of course made me kind of give him the side eye, like, you realize biologists don't make that much money, right? We're about equal, right? We're about equal. But again, it was this lack of value in the industry, even though the reality is that design has and continues to touch everything, whether we call it that or not. Design was the invisible disruptor before disruption was a word. That's just the truth that we need to face. But besides our makeup, we also need to understand the power of our industry. And I started to reflect on the power of our industry a lot more in 2014, because all the things you're seeing actually has been concurrently after 2014, but this was kind of that spark that made me move from, okay, let's have conversation, to, oh no, I need to be deep in this work. So August 9th, 2014, yell out, what do you think this day stands for? Don't be afraid to say it, come on. Ferguson, thank you. Or more likely, Michael Brown Jr. was murdered. There was a young man that lost his life. No matter where you are on the spectrum, we have to admit the reality that a young man lost his life. I don't care what anyone says, that is a fact that no one can dispute. And when August 9, 2014 occurred, and then the subsequent Ferguson uprisings after that, many people assumed that it was only about that one life. And it was about his life. And the reality that in St. Louis, we are one of the most segregated cities in the country, just like Chicago. Chicago, last time I saw a study, was number 8. St. Louis was number 5. And the reality with that segregation is that there's a lot of communities that have been erased and historically underinvested for an extremely long time. And this was a moment in which the community, again, because St. Louis has an activism history. Most people just haven't seen it on the national stage like this. But again, the community started to stand up and say, this is problematic, we need to do something about it. And at the time, I was working at a diversity inclusion organization, head of communications, in more the traditional design marketing field. And I recognized that when I was invited to the tables, it was because of my position, never because of the fact that I actually had just moved out of Ferguson 6 months prior to the uprising. My family and I actually were residents. Most people in St. Louis didn't even know that. They assumed that we were in some other neighborhood. And Ferguson, by just FYI, is a municipality. It is not like it's not like Chicago downtown or something. And so I wanted to create a space where people can come into this area, show up with their identities, but not just have a conversation around the trauma that they were dealing with, because there were a lot of spaces where people were reliving their trauma to educate, but create a space around how do we move from awareness to action and develop our own interventions to address St. Louis's racial divide. And at that time, I was 100% like designers have to be at the table. And this was more traditional design at that time of what I was thinking. Because in my opinion, designers was creating something out of nothing every single day. We navigate ambiguous and complex situations to the point where we're seeing a white sheet of paper, a white screen, or it's just something in our head. And then you turn around and you see buildings such as this. You see the chairs we're in, our clothes. You see all of these things that designers, actual practicing designers, touch. And yet for some reason, we're never at the table when it comes to social justice work. So we can design the infrastructure of our society, but yet some reason we can't design the infrastructure of our society. That was a problem. And so I was pushing for designers and creatives to be in the room and be part of the process, and not just the person with the sketchbook that's going to draw what you said, but they're actual co-creators of what we were doing. And so I'm gonna quickly go through some of the outputs of that day, or yeah, well, it was a 24-hour challenge, so it was a day. And yes, some people did not sleep. Let's not discuss. But one project that came out was called Cards Against Brutality. Because I'm in Chicago, I know this is gonna be easy. How many people have heard of Cards Against Humanity? So it's interesting because I had never heard of it prior to this. I have since played Cards Against Humanity. I do not discuss what happened in that room because it goes against my brand as a social justice warrior, but I did have a good time, okay? That being said, Cards Against Brutality, this project wasn't around, let's just create some cards that we give people. It was directly looking at how do we address media narration and framing of these stories that are impacting our perception of the reality of what's happening. And how do we shift the narrative of problematic terminology such as thug, which I consider the new N-word, to acknowledging that these individuals were human beings. They were someone's sons, daughters, neighbors, students, teacher. These are individuals that we actually lost, and for some reason, we have gotten to the point in society that we are okay with justifying losing lives, opposed to actually viewing these human beings as human beings. And so this card deck also had a curriculum piece in which they worked with college students, high school students, and police departments, and having them thinking about the humanity of the people in which live beside us or could be literally in the home with us today or sitting beside you. We also had a project called Look Beyond Your Fear. And this project was looking at the reality that we have a culture of fear in our society, and we particularly have a culture of fear of Black men. And no, this is not Antionette just saying it. There's actual stats that show that we have a culture of fear against Black men. we're more likely to cross the street, clutch our purse, lean closer to the door in the elevator if we see or a group of Black men. And so this project was asking people to acknowledge that fear and then try to look beyond it. And it started with looking at, again, the cultural fear of Black men. It's since expanded to looking at cultural fear of political affiliation, legalization of marijuana, same-sex marriage, etc. But having people really start to shift their mindsets around it. It consisted of public art engagements, of guerrilla art warfare campaigns, workshops all around the country itself. Another project that came out is called the Vibe Switch Project, in which this project was looking at how do we acknowledge the fact that we all deal with stereotypes and also take back our identities and owning who we are. And so it was very Mad Lib style and saying others have stereotyped me as blank, but in reality I am blank. To me, it seemed very inspired by Candy Chang. I don't know if you know of her work and the Before I Die wall. She also is a TED Fellow. I recommend looking her up, and a practicing designer. They had never heard of Candy Chang, but that public art participatory design element, to me, was very reminiscent of it. And this project was trying to get people to acknowledge that we all are dealing with these issues and we have to collectively do something about them together. This project was called Connected for Justice Project, and it was created by a woman named Deandra Nichols. If you don't know Dee Nichols, you should. And her big thing is what she calls cultural denominators. How do we convene people around things that we all engage with every day, like eating? Like, these are cultural denominators. But also, how do we go from wanting to do something to having an element of civic matchmaking? And so it's taking the component of essentially kind of like the matching technology of Tinder or Match.com, whether you're looking for, love of your life or a side piece, whatever works for you, to having that same essentially technology, but applying it to coming up with ideas and people volunteering to make it happen. And this project was only intended for the original protest in 2014. When it closed in November 2014, over 700 actions had occurred because of this one site. And so it was bringing people together in a digital space to also bring people together in a more analog space. And then the last project that came out of it was the Red Table Project. The kind of theme that they had was, how do you turn your strangers into neighbors? And this was directly looking at geographic segregation within St. Louis. We are well known for many of our streets for segregation, but one in particular is Del Mar, to the point where there's a term coined Del Mar Divide. There's been 2 mini documentaries on that street. One was by the BBC, another by Vox. And it is directly looking at the reality that on one side of the street, you have condemned home, limited access, primarily African Americans. And then on the other side of the street, literally, you just look across the street, you have one of the most well-known parks because the 1904 World Fair was there, boutique hotels, condominiums, primarily white. And this segregation was even how people engage with the space. And I definitely understand that. It was very personal to me because my godparents, who are white, lived in a condominium on one side of the street, and my mother and my siblings actually lived in a condemned home on the other side of the street. And so I was extremely interested in seeing how do you bring people together around food and around conversation, and not how are we going to address that race issue, because that is not how you start a conversation when you first meet someone. But what's your zodiac sign? I'm a Taurus, by the way. Shout out to Tauruses. What's your favorite ice cream? Things that we've actually lost because a lot of us don't know our neighbors. I'll admit, this project was done in 2014/2015. I still don't know my neighbors. Still to this day, it is a systemic issue that I think is across the board. Back in the day, people would say your community raised a child. we don't even fully know our communities anymore. And it, like, for me, part of it is I'm busy, part of it is my personality. My husband, on the other hand, is way too friendly, in my opinion. People know way too much, in my opinion. I ain't even gonna go there. But technically, he is a part of the community, and subsequently so am I. And so if something was to happen, I know for a fact people would protect my house or they would protect my family because he's built a rapport with the community there. And that is something that we've lost over time. And so all of this led to my mission. And that mission was pushing me for 4 years, almost 5. And then my story changed on May 2nd, 2018. This day was a fundraising day in St. Louis. It's called Give STL Day. I don't know if you all have an equivalent somewhat like that in Chicago, but it's when people donate to nonprofit organizations. And I was leading our fundraising campaign when I received a phone call that my 14-year-old brother had been shot. And so I get a call and they say, he's been shot in his arm. I'm one of the only people with flexible transportation in my family. And so I had to drive from my job, even though it was 10 minutes from the hospital, to get my sibling, which she was 30 minutes away, to drive back to the hospital, which was 40 minutes away. So it took us almost an hour and a half to get there. And when we made it into the lobby, my other sister, his twin, because he's a twin, called and said that he had died. And up until that point, I was doing this work out of, it was direct, but somewhat of an indirect connection. It was like I want to help, you know, I need to help. Yes, I have some connection to these things. Whereas when my brother was killed, it became way more personal. And I started to think about life expectancy and quality of life way more than just words at that point. And, you know, when he was taken away, I ended up writing an article about his passing. And I talked about the reality that gun violence is a product of design. I talked about the reality that that day I didn't just lose my brother, but we potentially lost another black man in the community, because the boy that committed the act was 13 years old. And he did it over an iPhone. And he found out he ended up receiving 5 years for what happened. And most people, when they hear about it, and this was actually in national news, most people, when they hear about it, they automatically assume what I want to hear is lock the boy up and put him under the jail and all these things. But for me, I don't want to hear that. Because I automatically think about the ripple effect of all of this. Not only on my family, on his family, on subsequent youth that were his friends, or their friends, actually, because they went to the same school. And, you know, also the reality that if he came back into the same environment in which he left when he committed the act, then that could be more trauma that's created because of the lack of support system. Not saying his family can't support him, but just our society tends to have this: if you commit an act, you automatically are persecuted for the rest of your life, especially if you're a black man. And I don't honestly want that young boy to become that. Yes, I lost my brother, and no words can explain what it feels to lose your only brother, especially your youngest sibling. But I also think about the other families that could and continues to lose their family members like I did, if I and we don't do something about it. And so I started doing more deeper and intentional work with young people. That in 2016, we shifted our mission to youth. Now it's just 100% youth. We still do work with institutions, but it's always with the intention of, how do we get you to support our youth? Or how do we create this opportunity for our youth to be co-facilitators, receive funding to get out of whatever situation? And actually this year we held a weekend engagement called Young Leaders for Civic Change, Eliminating Gun Violence, with 25 youth of color. And the sad part about this event was that it wasn't fully spurred by me losing my brother, because we had planned on doing this event in 2020, was spring 2020. This past summer, St. Louis has almost lost 2 dozen, if not right over 2 dozen youth due to gun violence since the start of May. So this is not a full year thing. It's not since my brother was lost. Since the start of May, we have lost 2 dozen kids due to gun violence in our region. And when we were doing this program, I found out that some of the youth in our program, one of them, her nephew, was one of the ones that was lost. He was 4 years old. Another one, she had actually lost 3 of her friends. And this is the reality that we have to deal with every day. And let me be clear, when I talk about this work, it's not to talk about just trauma, because there's many acts of resiliency in the community. This is one of them. And I think we tend to look at, oh, sad, let's help. But it's like, there's also things people are doing. And the reason we did this event was to bring in more of the resiliency piece, because I can't tell you how many convenings I was in which everyone kept saying, the children are our future. We need, or the other side, we need to fix the kids, one of the two. And yet they never had young people in the room. They never gave them agency to actually address the issue themselves. And so we received funding to not only have them in the room, they were paid for their time, so they all received a stipend. We paid for their transportation if they needed it, and they all received funding to bring their ideas to life. Those are the type of shifts that we need to have in our programmatic work and in our community-based work. And so a lot of this fits into the foundation of the reality is that violence is a major public health issue, and unfortunately, violence is another byproduct, in many cases, of racism. That is a major public health issue in our society. And Robert Wood Johnson Foundation found that every 7 minutes, a Black person dies prematurely due to the effects of racial discrimination. Every 7 minutes. I mentioned my brother, but I hadn't mentioned the fact that yet in my family, I do not know any Black man that has made it past the age of 56 in my family. My grandfather that raised me died at 55. His son, the uncle I mentioned, he died a few years ago, I think it was 2015, due to health complications, diabetes. And my grandfather was due to liver and dialysis poisoning. And so this reality is not just a nice to have. When we talk about the impact of design and all these efforts, I'm not just talking about it's something pretty. I'm talking about the infrastructure of our lives and the fact that our outcomes are by design. And so all of that led to my purpose and the reality in looking at that the systems in which we are working and living are designed. National Equity Project says that any system produces what it was designed to produce. When people say, this is not my America, I'm just like, okay, I don't know what America you've been looking at. No offense, okay? Just period. Or I can't believe this is happening, or this, something and shifted to make this happen the way it was. And it's like, no, this has been this way, and it's been designed this way. Let's not pretend that it's a different illusion. And so at my organization, this is our foundational belief. We believe all systems are by design, but that also means systems of oppression, inequality, and inequity are by design. And that means that they also can be redesigned. And so we are working to try to build a movement of redesigners for justice, particularly Black and Latinx youth, to design healthy and racially equitable communities. We also have done work with Indigenous youth as well. We are trying to figure out the best way to do that work without co-opting the Indigenous movement and being very intentional of supporting versus trying to erase and amplify ourselves. But I bring that up to acknowledge the reality that yes, there are many other identities that need healthy and racially equitable communities. We just have focused on Black and Latinx populations. We also focus on 4 different sectors that we call narrative and livelihood shapers, and we believe these sectors impact quality of life, life expectancy, and the perceptions we have about ourselves and others. As designers, you're in that media and technology industry, probably the strongest, but depending on where you end up working, you might intersect in those other industries as well. And there's a lot of power in those spaces. We also are changing the way people address systemic oppression and inequities, and understanding that we need to move from awareness to action. Yes, consciousness is key, and many of us haven't reached to that point of starting to build our consciousness, but we also need to move to the space that we actually do something about it. And so for us, we use design as that mechanism. A colleague of mine says that design is not about making things look good, but making things work. Understanding that it's not just the form of something, but it's also the function. And the thing that I think holds a lot of us up is when we talk about design, we talk about it as if it's only a craft. Whereas in 1960s, IBM defined design as the intention behind an outcome. We didn't define it that way, IBM did, back in the 1960s. We have actually built upon that definition and said it's the intention and unintentional impact behind an outcome. Because personally, I don't really care about your intentions. I want to know what's the impact of what you're doing, and also holding myself accountable to that same definition. No one should care about my intention. I need to be held accountable to the impact, whether it's positive or negative, that I'm making in my community. But understanding that human-centered approaches are not enough, and so we have been shifting our work to this space of equity and to this space of fairness and justice. The people in the workshop saw this image earlier. This is the one that we show the most so that people can understand that when we talk about equality, we are saying that we are working towards equal access or opportunity. But when we're talking about equity, we are working towards equal outcomes. And those are 2 different things. This is the process in which we developed called equity-centered community design. There's a few things that stand up about this. 1, everything is intersected. There is no start point, there's no end point. It's not a linear process. I don't know any problem-solving space where everything is linear. I really want to know how that works out. Also, and while yes, we like Post-it notes, it's not a checklist. Ooh, Sharpies, check. Like, no, that's not what we're trying to do. Also, as you noticed, power dynamics, power constructs, history, and healing is intersected across every step of the process. As I said in the workshop earlier today, my trauma doesn't go away because I'm prototyping. That what happened with me in my life and continues to happen is going to show up in every space in which I show up. And I am very conscious of that. So how do we acknowledge the power dynamics in the space, the role of trauma, resiliency, and healing in the space, and at the same time think about building out more diverse teams and defining what we mean by diverse, what we're talking about. Also understanding that we have to build our own humility to actually become empathetic. That it's not enough to just talk about the community you're in or the topic, but look at the intersection of racism in that work, sexism in that work, homophobia in that work. The list can go on. And then we still like to do our traditional design process because again, most of this stuff at this point, this top half is more from the diversity, equity, inclusion space. And most of these pieces here are from the design space. But the thing that we really like to point out is in testing and learning, what is your exit strategy in the community? Because when I think about inviting diverse co-creators, that's what's your entrance. But when testing and learning, what's your exit? Because we want to go into communities, and design industry in most traditional spaces are consulting industries, so we tend to be going into a space that's not our own. What are you actually doing to make sure you're not recreating trauma? And also, how are you going to leave that community with the capacity to do what they need to do themselves? For us, we are very intentional in having community, whom we call living experts, first step of the process. They literally are there every step of the way. They are not research subjects, which is what we tend to look at community as. They are co-creators and decision makers. How do we make sure that we are building their capacity for ownership from the very beginning? And to the point, my organization, even though we've received requests, we actually do not do consulting work. I know we've turned down a lot of money. I've had a lot of big philanthropy organizations ask us to do consulting work, and we won't do it because that doesn't fit our model of understanding that the community are living experts and we need to amplify them opposed to trying to amplify ourselves. And so we do turn down money around that. But we're not working for process adoption, we're working for a mindset shift. And ultimately, we're trying to get people to become redesigners for justice, or what we like to say is equity designers and design allies. These individuals are essentially the ones that don't just hear about it, they do something about it, but also understand, should I be in power, or should I step back and leverage my power and access on behalf of someone else? So very quickly, an equity designer is someone that put people and equity first. They're embedded in the community, they're working to change. They're constantly iterating, making and improving interventions, building upon existing resources, and have lived experience with the inequity. The reason we focus on lived experience with the inequity is because they, most of the time, are closest to the actual interventions to address the issue. They are directly impacted by it, but that proximity matters. And here's a photo of some of our equity designers we've been working with in St. Louis. Some of them went through our summer academy, some of them went through our gun violence initiative, some of them went through our food justice initiative in Denver, Colorado. And they are directly using their work, their mindsets, their process to address these issues in their own communities. But also we acknowledge they shouldn't do the work alone, and so allyship is important in this space. And design allies have a similar charge, except they may only be indirectly connected with that community, and opposed to having lived experience with the inequity, they leverage their power and access on behalf of the equity designers. And here's a photo of some in which it shows kind of the difference equity designers and design allies working together in this space. One thing I want to note is that this is not a job description. This is not a position that you show up to and clock in and clock out. This is a mindset, and the reality is that you can be an equity designer in one context and a design ally in another, and you need to be very conscious of which one you are in a space. When it comes to LGBTQIA+ rights, I cannot be an equity designer, but I can be a design ally. When it comes to being a survivor of, familial gun violence, I can be an equity designer for that space. I can be an equity designer for Black women's rights. And understanding when I should essentially be in power and when I should back up and leverage my power and access on behalf of others. And the reality is that we need both to actually get to the space of equitable outcomes, not one or the other, which we sometimes seem to think. And the communities and the teams you work with should consist of both. If they don't, you need to ask the question, why, and what are you going to do about it? I do want to highlight the fact that you should be working towards approaches and not this idea of solutions, because solutions don't exist. Solutions has this silver bullet mentality that it's going to be this one thing that's going to fix everything. I would love to see a problem that was fixed by one thing. I'll wait. Anyone? Nothing? Call me like you said brush your teeth. Some people argue also need to floss. There's no one approach to these, or one solution to these large complex issues. There are multiple approaches, drops in the buckets for ongoing change. So when I look at what I am trying to accomplish, I know that I am not going to accomplish it in my life. However, I am hoping that my drops in the bucket are getting us closer to that space of equity. I sometimes view my work as cathedral building. I'm not going to see that cathedral, but that foundation that I'm setting, as well as others, hopefully is giving a strong enough base that in the years in which that cathedral is final, it's going to be a beautiful, beautiful specimen. That's the approach that I take, and therefore I don't get discouraged when I hit a wall or something doesn't go the way I want it, because I'm understanding that it's part of the journey. But you have to acknowledge that it starts with you at the end of the day in doing this work. So here's the last thing I'm gonna give you with some tips. FYI, these are enamel pens that we have. No, you can't have one. We actually give them to our youth in our programs, but they say fight racism by design with design. But some things I wanna highlight. I want you to understand your power to design perspectives and outcomes. Also, appreciate and amplify the living expertise equally, if not more so, than academic and professional expertise. Don't ask why. Look at their why. They are living experts. And too many times we try to downplay someone's experience because we have studied something in a book or we Googled. People don't need to Google. They can tell you what it's like to live with certain things. There might just be barriers of communication. We may use different language, but we are still experts in what we are addressing. Also, don't design in ivory towers, but live and immerse yourself in the ground. Your computer is an ivory tower, FYI. You need to be on the ground. Also, question your proximity to power. Think about, should you step in or center others? I put ableist language because I do not like the term step in, step back. We discussed that a little bit earlier, but it is ableist language. You need to value the act of building trust and removing agendas. As designers, we tend to, and let me be clear, as human beings, we tend to come into a space with an agenda. And I can't tell you how many times people have asked me, how do I start doing work with the community? Well, first you need to actually build trust with the community and also remove the language of saying the community as if you are not a part of it. Because if you are not a part of that community, you shouldn't be doing any work, period. So shift that. Also, when people from historically underinvested communities speak, listen before questioning. I honestly don't want you to question, but sometimes we need to learn more, but listen, okay? And also understand that if you ask questions, they have the right to tell you no. They do not have to educate you. That is not their job. There's a thing called Google. Great invention. But it's too many times I've seen in spaces where people of different identities are asked to essentially educate others that don't have that identity. And I don't think we really reflect on how that actually also creates more trauma for that community as well. So when they speak and they make a choice to speak, listen. Also acknowledge that you're on a journey and learning while doing, and equally so is everyone else. Be kind with yourselves. Know that you're gonna make mistakes and you're gonna fail. And that's okay, that's part of the journey. And be kind with others and know that they're gonna make mistakes and they're gonna fail. And know that that's okay too. Also, you need to start and follow through. All the things that I've mentioned, in 2014, I gave myself one New Year's resolution because I found out that New Year's resolutions are like the worst lie invented in humankind. Like, how many times you gonna lose weight, boo? It's just whatever. But I gave myself one New Year's resolution, and it's been the same New Year's resolution that I've used since then, and it was follow through. And everything that I've been seeing that I now reflect on was because I made that commitment to myself that if you have the idea, test it and learn. Also, again, analyze power, trauma, all that, but also follow through on it. I wanted to show this piece because this is a tool that we created. If you want to have access to some of these postcards, you can. But in 2017, we started a campaign called Artwork for Equity. where people can take postcards designed by artists around the world. They also create them in posters. That's pushing for respect, justice, equity, and inclusion. And we actually convert, well, one, they create the graphics for our campaign. It's not like it's just public stuff. But we convert them into postcards in which people are able to write a message to their elected official or business leader. If you're looking, many times I get the question, how do I start? Start here. Pick something of importance to you and start even with the smallest step. Because when you do something small, most of the time you start building more and more. I can still pinpoint my first freelance client that I had that was social justice related. I can pinpoint my first design project that I did that was social justice related that had nothing to do with a client. And all of these things continually grew over time. But I started small. And know that that's what matters. Start and follow through. So I want to leave with this quote. She's not a colleague anymore. Actually, she's my staff member. We just hired her. We didn't poach her, I promise. But a few years ago, she made the statement that the notion that work only calls upon our professional selves and not our personal selves is a problematic one. We need to look at the reality that who we are shows up in a space whether we intentionally wanted to or not. And if we are too busy trying to hide it, most of the time what happens is that we end up creating more trauma on ourselves and also feeling this sense of anxiety and putting barriers and limitations on ourselves. I want to be clear, not every culture and not every institution gives you the space to be safe, to actually share your personal self. But a commitment that I made to myself years ago was that if I can't be happy in an environment, then it's time for me to move on because, again, my life is not infinite. And so I need to shift if I have to. So thank you all for your time, and I guess I will take questions. Yeah? Do I literally just take questions? Like, how does this go? Yeah, I can walk it around. Any questions? This one? Okay.
I participated in the training session earlier, and I'm thinking you're talking about 2020, and I'm just curious about like the election coming up and how you see that impacting your youth, because the youth, they're absorbing everything and they're listening to conversations about the election. So kind of how you can combine politics and design in a way that doesn't alienate people.
So we do have, there's one program called the Community Design Apprenticeship Program. That one, it was the one where you saw the community sign with them holding that. That program is directly with formerly incarcerated and criminal justice system affected youth. And in that program, we do essentially go through not only traditional design, but also policy design and other topics, curriculum design, et cetera, to get them to understand the impact policies have on their life. And so we've been taking more of that approach with our youth, particularly in that program. Our Work for Equity campaign, in the workshop earlier, I mentioned that the 2020 theme is going to be ancestors' vote, and looking at the reality of the forms of voter suppression that many communities have had to overcome and still continually overcome, that's prohibiting them from actually getting more politically, just even at the basic level of the right to vote involved. But when I go to 100% politics on whether Trump is elected or someone else is elected, I'm gonna be honest, when Trump was elected and everyone was sad about it, and believe me, I was sad about it too, no matter what your political affiliation is, it was something that saddened me because my sons were sad, and my sons at the time were 8 years old. I saw in them this disappointment because they have been trying to push for more of they see people looking to push more inclusion in their spaces, and they felt in that time that they were losing that when he was elected. And so many people ask me the question of, what are you going to do now that Trump's elected? And I always say I'm going to do the same thing we've always been doing, because he is just an embodiment of something that's been around for many, many years. And so for us, it is not, I don't care who gets in the office, whether locally or nationally, because many of them have drunk from that white supremacy colonization mindset, just like all of us has. And I don't care if they're independent, they're Republican or Democrat, there's still going to be problematic things that need to be addressed. President Barack Obama, we worked with Obama Foundation, but he was horrible with immigration rights. Horrible. Most people don't know that, but he was. It didn't happen just when Trump got in office. He deported many, many people. And so it is not one or done, or if someone's elected, then we need to step up. We're consistently trying to shift the work throughout, opposed to just being reactive to that.
Question in the back.
Hi, Antionette. I have so many questions that I could ask.
Are you really asking a question? I was just in your office.
I know. So this is me asking a question.
Come on with it.
I'm hoping will benefit the audience.
Uh-huh.
So you presented a little bit on the Equity Summit, and I feel like oftentimes when we have these conversations around equity in design and inclusion in design, it tends to be the same people in the room.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm wondering, especially for some of the students in the audience who are looking at going out into industry, how do we champion for this change, this equity-centered design as a framework in these larger organizations where oftentimes as designers, even with the intent that we might have, we feel like just a cog. Especially with you saying that whole equity was it was a showpiece that you feel like didn't really amount to anything. But how can the students that are going out from our program or other programs kind of think about ways that they can champion for this mindset in larger design organizations?
So the biggest thing I would say is that the largest shifts have happened when there's been a movement around it. And understanding that you are not going to be able to do it alone, and the movement can be horizontal, or it could be also working with someone that's already embedded, and that's a champion, that could be a champion for what you're trying to shift. And the example I have is when I had showed the image of, it was like squares with all the people up here. Most people, they see, oh, you were the founding chair of the Diversity Inclusion Task Force. Well, let me be clear, this was the third iteration of that task force. I actually approached them in 2013 about their lack of diversity work, and I received a resounding no. They were not hearing it. So I actually ended up going out and building and so understand that one vote, one person does matter, but when you collectively work together to do it, it's going to, it will leave a greater dent. And I would talk I don't want to relive what I went through in agency. It was very, very hard for me. That was one of the first places that in the professional setting, literally the executive team used the N-word like I wasn't in the room. I mean, it was a problematic space. But I still remember the reality that in all the spaces I've been in, I had to talk to the people that actually already was dealing with it, but most of the time they didn't also have that network. And what I mean by that is when, I was a resident for the day at IDEO, I went to IDEO, they have employer resource groups. They're literally a group of people that's trying to create the shift from within. And we tend to want to come from our own personal piece, but when you actually, or individually, but when you actually are working together, that's when that shifts start to happen. And so even on our own posters, we say we're trying to build a youth-led community center movement. We're not just trying to just focus on just one thing, because we know that's not going to create the shift. And so we're trying to build a movement. And to me, that is what's going to need to happen in these spaces, because at the end of the day, you're going to be pushing it up against the status quo. And the status quo is very contempt in being the status quo. And they have resources, they have history, they have a lot of things behind them that if when you come as a single, they're, again, power differential. You're looked at as, oh, okay, that's just that one person. Maybe they'll leave. Maybe we'll find a way to get them out. But when you have many people collectively building a movement to try to change, then they can't ignore it. Why are you waving your hand?
Oh, there's a question? Okay.
Oh. So, and then they can't ultimately ignore it. The example when they have you break one stick and then they have you try to break many sticks, there's actually an importance of that. I know when I first saw it, I was like, that's really cheesy, but there's truth to it. When it's many of us, when someone's burnt out or tired, there's people in the network to support you. When we need to push for change, there's people in the network to support you. And if you look at St. Louis as an example, all the shifts that's happening now in the city is because people came out and created a movement. It wasn't just because one person did something. They collectively said, we are going to do something. And I guarantee you, if you're thinking it, there's probably 5 to 10 other people in your space that's also thinking the exact same thing.
Hello.
Hello.
So I'm really intrigued by your equity-centered community design process.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you say that you're not interested in consulting, you want to be embedded in the community.
Yeah.
I think designing an ecosystem or designing an entire, understanding the different levels and being able to connect the different levels is important. So this idea of a movement and making sure that youth are engaged to push that change is really important. I do wonder though, given your experience and your expertise in this space, how would you use this process to kind of redesign the philanthropic system that has multilateral agencies engaged with developing countries, right? Because that method or that model is a consulting-based model, and they had a lot of say about how developing countries as a whole move forward. And I do think that there's a place for this process, but I do wonder what about the process would be different, or how would the framing be different to affect that particular system?
Mm-hmm. One thing I do want to clarify, we don't do consulting, but when we talk about capacity building, we also do it in institutions as well. So we've actually worked with philanthropic organizations to have them think about how equity-centered community design could be used not only within their orgs, but also by their grantees, and how they need to think about the power that they have and the trauma that they're creating in their communities. The feedback loop that we essentially are setting up is that the plan is, as we continue to do those institutional works, that the institution also then in turn support these communities, opposed to only development work. Also, that the youth themselves become co-facilitators to also bring in that youth narrative, person of color narrative, to shift it through that lived expertise, as well as just their knowledge as well. But when I think about the philanthropic space, it's funny you bring it up, because one of my team members actually was just in Berlin at a conference around humanitarian aid, essentially saying what you were just saying. And apparently I wasn't there, but she's created some shift because someone literally got on stage and called out what she said, our definition of equity, our type of work, etc. And so we still do work with philanthropic orgs. When I think about what would need to change, honestly, I don't think there would need to be a change in the process. It would need to be a change of how they actually would be willing to accept the process. Because most philanthropic orgs do not see a problem with what they're doing. Most philanthropic organizations haven't even had the conversation that their funding actually has come from the backs of people of color. And so if they haven't even had the conversation that our wealth that we are now distributing to communities to try to help actually is from actually the mistreatment of communities that we're trying to help or ignore, then it's going to be a hard challenge of just trying to get them to just shift their funding. So some have taken more the traditional approach of, if you have a person of color or a different identity status or whatever it may be in the room, you tend to see more of the shift away from the savior complexity mindset. And so it tends to go back to the traditional who has access to pipeline situation. But I also would argue How do we build the racial consciousness, even of people of color, et cetera, that's going to be in those positions? Because we assume just because someone is a certain color, then automatically they also have racial consciousness around the issues themselves. And so, yes, in some cases it has been starting to be successful. Ford Foundation is one, Kellogg Foundation is another. There also are local groups like Life as We Know It that were created by activists, people of color, shifting the narratives in that space. But it is going to continually be an uphill battle because we're talking about systems that has literally bottled savior complexity through giving, and they've bottled savior complexity in an educational platform such as international development, and no one is truly calling them out for it. And so it needs to be, and when I say no one, I'm talking like a larger collective movement of people, and they're not hearing it all the way. So it has to be a collective effort to do it, but I don't personally think it's going to change in a year. I think that it's going to take a collective effort to actually shift that, but that requires them to, how do I say it? That requires them to look at the hard truths of how they were even created and founded in the first place. And in Canada, they have the Truth and Reconciliation effort, thinking about the actual mistreatment of Indigenous community. And so there's this reparations approach in Canada, even though they still have rampant racism of other identities in that country. United States, we don't even acknowledge the impact of slavery. We're told that we should get over it. And so that is the mindset that are leading these institutions, and unfortunately, a lot of them are hiring the same mindsets to take over the role. So it's going to take a multifaceted approach.
Any more questions? Otherwise, we could do the raffle. Oh, one more.
My classmates and I have been talking recently about politics and technology. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the impact of technology on equity in current times, and do you see a place for technology in creating equity?
You cut in and out, but just for clarification, do I see a space for tech in shifting and getting us to a more equitable society?
Right. Mm-hmm. And what are your thoughts on like as of right now, how do you think technology has impacted equity?
I think with technology, just like everything, you have positives and you have negatives. I know of primarily POC-led ventures that use technology to work towards a space of equity. One of them is named, the org is called Raheem AI, and they are directly using tech to try to dismantle or interrupt the police brutality system in society, particularly United States context. Also, there's a colleague of mine that works at the Center for Police Equity, or Policing for Equity, let me fix that. And he actually just did a TED Talk, won Audacious Prize, just received a lot of funding because for the last 10 years, they've actually been conducting research using data and tech to actually show how police brutality is happening in communities and what actual police stations need to do to shift beyond, oh, let's give everyone a body cam. And so there's orgs like that are kind of on the outside looking in the same with politics. Civic Eagle, it's an organization that it is app-based effort in which they are actually raising transparency of policies that are in effect in the political government, which most of us are not aware of the policies. We know more about politicians, and we don't really know much about them than we actually do about the policies. And so all these ventures I'm naming, though, were created by people of color. And so there's some org, and many of them, that's now saying, how do we get people to not be just not producers, consumers of technology, but the producers and creators of it? I do agree with that. I just sometimes think that we are putting all of our eggs in the bucket of technology, hoping that it's going to solve the problem, when technology is just another byproduct of humankind. And so it's going to have the bias and the prejudice and all these other things that every other piece of society is having. And the reality is that technology is just an amplifier. And so when people were talking about Facebook, and let's be clear, they have done a lot of problematic things, but many people were talking about, well, Facebook is just silos and you're talking to like-minded people. That's what's happening throughout history. It's always been that way. Now technology is just amplifying the self-selection component. And so we have to acknowledge that technology is going to amplify the negative, just like it's going to amplify the positive. I'm more thinking about who are going to be the creators behind the scene that actually are going to shift these pieces to where they need to be. And so when I think about bias, algorithm bias in the tech space, I actually just saw a great platform where they essentially didn't have a bias against people of color, but it was created by a woman of color. So it's tend to be that lived experience type setup. I think that if you want to use technology, just make sure that you're not trying to use technology to erase the need for human connection, and the fact that it should be centered and rooted in all of your work, whether it's the analog form of technology, it's just speaking, or it's the digital form of technology.
Any more questions? Okay. If it's all right, we can have you pick 2 raffle tickets.
Oh, okay, sure.
And then we usually do a picture in the front. Are you up for that?
Oh, I stay ready.
Okay.